Καλημέρα και καλησπέρα σας. Good morning and good evening. My name is Kelly Polychroniou and I'm Senior Lecturer in Modern Greek in the Department of Classical Studies at Boston University and Director of the Modern Greek Program and founder of the BU Philhellenes. I warmly welcome you to our event, our online event, with a special guest, Professor John Camp, the longtime director of the Athenian Agora Excavations at the American School for Classical Studies in Athens. Professor J. Samons, Chief Academic Officer at the American College of Greece and Professor of Classical Studies at BU, is moderating this event. This event was organized in cooperation with the Greek Consulate of Boston and the Institute for Hellenic Culture and the Liberal Arts at the American College of Greece to commemorate the 200-year anniversary of the beginning of the Greek War for Independence and the 2,500-year anniversary of the end of the Persian Wars. It's a great honor now to introduce the Honorable Consul General of Greece in Boston, Mr. Stratos Ευθυμίου. Mr. Ευθυμίου is a great supporter of our department and the BU Philhellenes. We have organized many very successful events together, and we greatly appreciate him being such a great friend to BUPH and to me personally. Consul General Ευθυμίου, welcome.
Good evening in Athens and good afternoon in Boston. The huge news here is, as you may know, that our efforts for a direct flight connecting Boston to Athens bore fruits, and Delta announced on Sunday a direct flight from Athens to Boston, the Athens of America. This bridge will help study abroad programs and significant initiatives such as the BU Philhellenes. It will attract more students to Greece to excellent academic institutions such as the American College of Greece. This bridge will help also researchers, archaeologists, friends of classical Greece who want to come to see, understand, and enjoy the archaeological and cultural landscape of Greece. And I can't think of a better bridge connecting the US with Greece than Professor John Camp, the director of the Athenian Agora Excavations, a legend in his field who dedicated his life in the archaeological research and the discovery, protection, and documentation of the Athenian topography. At the Consulate General of Greece in Boston, we have a more personal connection to Professor Camp. Every visitor who comes to the Consulate General to visit the Robert Mackay permanent exhibition of photographs receives a catalog of the exhibition with photos of Greek archaeological landscapes. Professor Camp was so kind to introduce the catalog with a beautiful text, and in a way he's always with us here in Boston and in the hands literally of all our precious guests. I'm personally grateful to Professor Camp for honoring us with his participation today, and I would like to thank Professor Polychroniou from Boston University and Professor Samons from the ACG for creating the conditions for today's joint event on such an important occasion. With this, I would like to invite my good friend, Professor J. Samons, Senior Vice President and Chief Academic Officer, and the Executive Director of the Institute for Hellenic Culture and the Liberal Arts at the American College of Greece, and Professor also of Classical Studies at Boston University. Jay, the floor is yours.
Ευχαριστώ, κύριε Πρόξενε. It's great to see you again, even at this tremendous distance. There's been so many good times at the consulate there. And it's a great pleasure tonight to welcome our special guest, John Camp. He really is one of those people who needs no introduction, but I'm going to force him to sit through one anyway and do my best to embarrass him. But of course, he is the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Professor of Classics at Randolph-Macon College. His undergraduate degree was from a little-known institution called Harvard, but he quickly made his way up the scales to Princeton, where he received his master's and PhD. He has been digging at the Agora since 1966, became assistant director of excavations there in 1973. And in 1994, the director, a position he continues to hold. For the years 1985 to 1996, he was the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Classical Studies at the American School for Classical Studies in Athens. John Camp has published reams on the Agora and other subjects, but I'm going to mention a few things. One is a wonderful book called The Athenian Agora, Excavations in the Heart of Athens, which was published in 1986. And it was described in a review in the American Journal of Archaeology by Ross Holloway, a professor at Brown, where I went to graduate school, as a quote, as a model of what archaeological popularization can be, both visually and in the text, one could ask for nothing better than this book. And that's a book anybody can pick up and immediately become a kind of amateur expert on archaeology in the heart of Athens. He, of course, also is the author of the Agora Site Guide. He is the author of a book called The Archaeology of Athens, which was described by one reviewer as simply the best combination of archaeology and history I've ever come across. For those of you who are a little more technically minded, you'll want to trace through his excavations in the Athenian Agora series in Hesperia, the journal Hesperia, which were publications that were required reading for graduate students, classicists, and archaeologists around the world. I will tell you one thing about John Camp that you might not know, and that is that lots of students I knew, lots of graduate students went to the American School for Classical Studies, and they came back with wildly different experiences, you know, but they all shared one thing in common. They would all come back and say, this guy, John Camp, is such a great guy. He would host us for pizza. We would go over to his house. People would play cards, bridge. Everybody had the same impression, and it was hard for someone. I never got to experience this, so it was hard for me to put the images together. No, John Camp is the famous archaeologist. You know, he's supposed to not. You don't actually get to talk to a guy like that, much less hang out with him and eat pizza. But this was a universal impression he made, and I wonder how many graduate students went on to careers in classics because they thought maybe I could be a little bit like John Camp. So it is a great pleasure that I didn't get to experience that. He did agree to join the advisory board for the Institute for Hellenic Culture and the Liberal Arts. So I feel like I'm getting just a little taste of the experience of John Camp here, admittedly much later in life than graduate school. So before I turn it over to Professor Camp, let me just say that those of you who want to ask questions, he's graciously agreed to answer questions. You can write them in the Q&A, question and answer function on the Zoom chat, and then I'll share those questions with him. So with that said, let me turn this over to Professor John Camp.
Thank you very much, Jay, for that generous introduction, and to all the people and all the institutions that have arranged today's presentation. I've had as much help as I could possibly ask for. I'm going to start with an apology because I don't like to read lectures, but in this instance, since we're lacking the reason for giving a lecture, the eye contact you can make between audience and speaker, we're not going to have that anyway. And there are a fair number of ancient quotes that I want to cite, and I did not memorize them, so I will be able to read them. I should also say that my idea of high technology is a mechanical pencil instead of a wooden one. And Professor Samons has very graciously agreed to run my slides, the illustrations. So we will be having a break, as it were, when I ask for the next slide to appear. And I apologize for that as well. You are dealing with a serious technophobe this morning and this evening if you're in Athens. But what we're talking about is the Persian invasion of Athens and the Athenian response to it, and to the destruction of the city, and to an extent, the recovery from that destruction as we celebrate 2,500 years since one of the pivotal battles of history, the Battle of Salamis. So I think we'll just go ahead and start, if we may, with the first illustration and start talking about the Persian destruction of Athens. You're seeing here just a model of the city, and the Persian sack of Athens in 480, 479 BC is one of the landmarks, both for Greek archaeology and the history of Athens. Two of our favorite authors, Thucydides and Herodotus, are concise but absolutely unequivocal as to the damage done. Herodotus gives the more detailed account of the actual events, telling us that Xerxes, when he took the citadel, quote, plundered the temple and burnt the entire Acropolis. And when 10 months after the Battle of Salamis and having wintered in Thessaly, the Persian general Mardonius returned and occupied Athens and then withdrew to Plataea, he, quote, first burnt Athens and utterly overthrew and demolished whatever wall or house or temple was left standing. Thucydides, setting the stage for his description of the Themistoclean wall, writes, for of the encircling wall, only small portions were left standing, and most of the houses were in ruins, only a few remaining in which the chief men of the Persians had themselves taken quarters. Diodorus Siculus gives the longest account of all, writing and drawing on sources other than Herodotus and Thucydides. For the first attack, he says, Xerxes entered Attica and ravaged the countryside, and then he razed Athens to the ground and sent up in flames the temples of the gods. And while the king was concerned with these affairs, his fleet sailed from Euboea to Attica, having sacked on the way both Euboea and the coast of Attica. And for the second assault, after wintering in Thessaly and his occupation of Athens, Mardonius was so angry with them that he ravaged the entire countryside, razed the city to the ground, and utterly destroyed the temples that were still standing. So there we have it. About as clear as one could ask, Athens was wiped off the map. The literary sources are pretty clear and largely unanimous as to the extent of the destruction. It was total. The primary question we will consider today is how reliable are those sources? And for this, we're going to turn to the archaeology. And I tell my students that archaeology can be badly misinterpreted, but it won't lie to you, whereas most human beings will lie to you. And the example I like to give is I think it's the Phoenix Garbage Project, where for 1 month, the group of scholars interviewed and students interviewed the residents of a 10-block area in Phoenix, Arizona, about their patterns of consumption. And they said they had long lists, they had check things that they wanted to check off. And they simply asked, what did you buy? What did you use? What did you throw away? What goes on in your house in terms of consumption? And they did this for a whole month to get a good picture of these houses. They learned lots of things. And among them, they learned that in 1 out of 4 houses in that area used beer regularly. And then for the next month, they didn't talk to those people at all. They collected their garbage and they went through it with a fine-tooth comb. And they checked off everything again, and they compared what they learned from the owners of the houses and the people living in them and the archaeological record, that is to say, the material remains of their lives. And it turns out, if you go by the garbage, 3 out of 4 households in Phoenix, Arizona use beer regularly. And that is a good example of where archaeological evidence is perhaps a little better than documentary evidence told to you by an observer. So we are checking Herodotus, Thucydides, and Diodorus Siculus in the archaeological record. Next slide, please. Number 2, it should be. We're up at about number 5 or 6 here. Oh, there it is. Thank you. When we turn to the archaeology of Athens in the early 5th century BC, we find ample evidence of destruction. On the Acropolis, the old temple of Athena, seen here on the left, made of limestone with marble trim and pedimental figures of a gigantomachy, was destroyed. So was the partially built older Parthenon with its superstructure of marble, under construction at the time, on the right, as was the older propylon that gave access to the sanctuary, and the archaic version of the Athena Nike temple. That is, all 3 archaic temples dedicated to Athena and the gateway into the sanctuary were destroyed in the first half of the 5th century BC. Next slide, please. Also, several small limestone Doric buildings decorated with pedimental sculptures and often referred to as treasuries because of their similarity to buildings at Olympia, Delphi, as seen here, Delos, and perhaps Nemea. Could we have the next slide, please? And here is the pediment of one of those archaic treasuries from the Acropolis. These have all been recently restudied by Nancy Klein, and most of them seem to have gone out of use at the same time as the temples. Next slide, please. And you can see a chart. You will, back one, please. Yep. You will see a chart here put together by Nancy Klein showing how midway across there, 3 of the 5 treasuries show signs of destruction at the same time as the big temples and the gateways. In addition to buildings, broken votive sculptures of chori and animals, marble periranteria, inscribed bases, and shattered votive pottery were found in great numbers on the Acropolis. Dozens of scholars of different disciplines, architecture, pottery, sculpture, stratigraphy, and epigraphy, have been over the evidence with a fine-tooth comb, and there are few, if any, dissenting voices expressing doubt that the Acropolis fared as recorded in our sources. The evidence shows that the buildings and sculptural monuments of the principal sanctuary of Athens were reduced to rubble, burned or broken, or both. Next slide, please. Nope. Number 6, if we're going by numbers. Yes, thank you. When we descend to the Agora, we find that here too the Persians can be identified, though the evidence and the conclusions drawn from it have been somewhat more contentious. The chronology of Attic pottery has been the subject of much discussion, and in the 1980s, an attempt was made to question the date of several early Agora buildings. The response came from Leslie Shear in a masterful and painstaking article in Hesperia for 1993, analyzing in detail the evidence cited in the Agora for the Persian destruction. For the Agora, the evidence is of a very different character than that from the Acropolis, consisting primarily of 5 pits and 16 wells, and their distribution is shown murkily on the right there, largely deriving from houses and shops crowded around the periphery of the Agora Square. Next slide, please. Most wells usually produce massive amounts of pottery, and once abandoned, fill up and become conveniently closed deposits. Shear's detailed catalog of sherd and shape counts allowed him to demonstrate the homogeneity and the contemporaneity of these wells in comparison with the other 400 wells excavated in the Agora, all but proving thereby that they were abandoned at the same time, evidently as a result of the Persian sack. Next slide, please. More recently, a 17th well was excavated in 1994. In this case, 100% of the pottery was kept in order to allow a detailed assessment which was written by Kathleen Lynch and published in 2011. The well, next stone, please. The well had a stone-lined shaft. Now we're going a little ahead of ourselves. Back a couple. Back again. Yeah, thank you. The well had a stone-lined shaft and was 5.8 meters deep and was about a meter in diameter. Next slide, please. In all, 233 objects were inventoried and 48 5-gallon tins of fragmentary pottery were recovered. Next slide, please. Basically representing the pantry of a house, though perhaps not its storage area. The makeup of the group was close to that of many of the other Persian deposits, and Lynch was able to make the distinction established by Shear and seen here between immediate and delayed post-Persian cleanup. The first came, those on the left, coming right after 479 BC, and the others dating from 475 to 460. So we use the Persian destruction as a fixed date for our understanding of how to date Athenian pottery. Next slide, please. And here you have the distinction recognized by Stewart and Lindenlof on the Acropolis deposits, where the real destruction debris, the so-called Perser chute, was confined to the north side of the citadel. That is to say, in the model to the area of the temple at the top, or the darker area in the plan below. Everything that's dark there is actually 480, 470, right after the cleanup, when the Athenians returned after the Battle of Salamis. The lighter gray shows considerable material dating to the early 5th century, but coming down perhaps as late as the 460s. So with the Acropolis and the Agora, we have evidence of two types of material: domestic deposits and votive deposits, both seeming to confirm our ancient testimonia as to the nature and extent of the Persian sack of Athens. Next slide, please. Back one. Thank you. We are going to defer consideration of the evidence from the Kerameikos for the time being and turn instead to Attica, as it is an inseparable part of Athens politically. Here, as noted, both Thucydides and Herodotus are largely silent, whereas Diodorus is not. Both Xerxes and Mardonius are said to have ravaged the countryside, and Xerxes' fleet sacked on the way both Euboea and the coast of Attica. And here you see with those little blue arrows, some of the sites we'll be talking about, starting and going in a clockwise direction from the upper right around Cape Sunion and into the Saronic Gulf. And the coastal demes of eastern Attica were right on the route from Euboea to Phaleron, and here too the archaeology seems to confirm the literature, enough so that we might suspect Persian activity even without the testimony of Diodorus. These demes or sanctuaries specified as destroyed in the written sources, mostly Pausanias, include Brauron, Hera near Phaleron, Demeter at Phaleron, and Eleusis. Those that show signs in the archaeological record of damage and subsequent rebuilding include Rhamnus, Sunion, and Eleusis. Those which we might have expected to have been attacked, but for which we have no clear evidence, literary or archaeological, include Marathon, Artemis Tauropoulos at Halai Araphanides, Thorikos, and Apollo at Cape Zosteer. Next slide, please. At Rhamnus, the sanctuary of Nemesis was functioning in the 6th century BC to judge by the votive offerings. From fragments recovered at the site, there seems to have been a small Doric temple there, as well as a modest fountain house, both of which are assumed on the basis of the archaeological evidence to have been destroyed in 480 or thereabouts. Next slide, please. At Brauron, the sanctuary of Artemis is thought to have had a temple dating to the late 6th century BC, though the final publication of the archaeological history of the site has been delayed by the unexpected death of the excavator John Papadimitriou. Literary sources, preserved primarily in the text of Pausanias, however, preserve a tradition that the Persians plundered the site. Pausanias's description of a sanctuary in Sparta reads, "The place called Limnion is a sanctuary of Artemis or Thea. The wooden image is said to be the famous one which Orestes and Iphigenia once stole from the Taurians. The Lacedaemonians say it was brought to their country because Orestes was king there. This story seems more likely to me than the one the Athenians tell. For what would have induced them to leave the statue at Brauron? Or why, when the Athenians were preparing to evacuate the country, did they not take the image with them on board ship? We are asked to believe the Athenians calmly allowed the image to fall into the hands of the Persians. For the image at Brauron was carried to Sunion and was afterwards presented by Seleucus to the Syrians of Laodicea, who possess it to this day." Next slide, please. One would expect the seaside deme of Thorikos, lying between Brauron and Sunion, to be an obvious target for the Persian fleet. But the literary sources are silent, with no mention of any Persian activity involving Thorikos, while the excavations there have uncovered no trace of destruction or abandonment. Thorikos was one of the mining centers of Athens, however, and Chester Starr has cited numismatic evidence which suggests a drop in the production of Athenian silver coinage between 480 and 450 BC. Next slide, please. The sanctuary Poseidon at Sunion was active in the late Archaic period, with the peripteral temple on the summit of the cape and the sanctuary adorned with more than a dozen kuroi, most found discarded in a pit. Dating to circa 490-480 BC, the Doric peripteral temple was built of limestone, and many pieces of it, seen here on the right, column drums, capitals, wall blocks, and architraves, were reused, built into the foundations of its marble classical successor, dated to the 440s. Next slide, please. The Temple of Apollo and his family at Cape Zosteer has been dated in its original phase to circa 500 BC. No signs of Persian activity have been cited in the archaeological record, though the Persians did sail by the peninsula on their retreat from Salamis. Next, please. The Sanctuary of Demeter at Eleusis provides some of the clearest evidence, both literary and archaeological, for the Persian destruction of the deme site and the sanctuary. Herodotus refers indirectly to the destruction of the sanctuary in his account of the Battle of Plataea. I find it surprising that though the battle took place by the Grove of Demeter, not a single Persian, as it turned out, either entered the sanctuary or died in there. Most of them fell around the outside of the sanctuary on consecrated ground. Insofar as one may speculate about divine matters, I think the goddess herself kept them away because they had burnt her temple, the Anacteron, at Eleusis. In terms of archaeology, Eleusis has been among the most extensively excavated and studied of the Attic sites. Persian destruction debris was reported by the excavators, and the contemporary peribolus of the sanctuary, made of mud brick resting on a stone socle of polygonal masonry, was breached at its southeast angle. Following a careful reading of late 5th century inventories and noting the fresh condition of many blocks reused from the archaic telesterion, Leslie Shear has argued that the Pisistratid building of the 6th century was deliberately dismantled to make way for a larger version, which was under construction when the Persians arrived and destroyed the sanctuary. So for Attica, we would list Rhamnus, Brauron, Sunion, Phaleron, and Eleusis as showing evidence of the Persians, either literary or archaeological. Next slide, please. While Marathon, seen here, represented here by this column, the trophy from the Battle of Marathon, Artemis, Tauropolis at Lutza, Thorikos, and Apollo at Cape Zosteer lack any clear evidence for their presence. Next slide, please. What happened in Athens after the defeat of the Persians at Plataea and their withdrawal from Greece is by no means clear. Two issues in particular concerning the Athenian recovery have been a source of uncertainty and controversy. The pre-Persian fortification wall, if there was one, and the temples on the post-Persian Acropolis and in Attica. Was there a wall protecting the lower city when the Persians attacked Athens? Thucydides seems to apply so when he writes, "The bounds of the city were extended at every point of the circumference." It should be noted, however, that no certain trace of the pre-Persian archaic circuit wall has ever been reported, and not everyone believes there was one. From the sources and Rune Fredriksson's study of the archaic city walls, it seems to me almost certain that such a wall once existed. One place where we may still get a good shot at it is in the Agora excavations, where when we have removed 80 meters of Hadrian Street, we should be able to determine if the Eridanus River served as the northern boundary of the city, that seems likely, or whether the river was bridged in order to carry the wall further to the north. Next slide, please. Or something like the west wall at Eretria, which follows a watercourse with a gate and tower serving also as a bridge across the stream, as seen here. Next slide, please. Rune Fredriksson's survey lists 101 fortified archaic cities known from external evidence, literary sources, or masonry styles, represented by the three overlapping circles you see here. In addition to Athens, his list includes Argos, Corinth, Eretria, Thebes, and Aegina, which is to say all of Athens' neighbors. It seems that archaic Greek cities did not actually follow the belief expressed by Alcaeus, quote, "No stone nor timber, nor the craft of the joiner make the polis. But wheresoever are men who know how to keep themselves safe, there are walls and there a polis." Paraphrased by Plato, that bronze and iron must form the ramparts of the city rather than rock. So it seems as though Athens, like all its contemporary neighbors, was indeed fortified before the Persians arrived. Next slide, please. Jim Sickinger has been studying the ostraca found in recent years north of Hadrian Street and mostly behind the painted stoa. He has identified more than 300, which make up 5 main groups. And he reports that all these ostraca are from the 480s BC. Next slide, please. And here is a very fine one, particularly for Xanthippus, the son of Ariphone, and Xanthippus, of course, is the father of Pericles. And we know he was thrown out of town in 484, 483 BC. And all these ostraca are found just outside where we would place the city wall along the banks of the Eridanus River. From the Kerameikos, Stefan Brenna has recently published the huge deposit found there in the 1960s, some 8,000, all dating to the late 470s. That, of course, agrees with the notion that the various groups were deposited outside the line of the city wall in use at that time, either before or after 479. So Sickinger's group seems to suggest the wall was there in the 480s and the ostraca were deposited just outside the line of the wall. And Brenna's shows the same thing for the Kerameikos about a decade later, where the ostraca are being discarded outside the line of the Themistoclean circuit of ancient Athens. Next slide, please. Back one. Thank you. On the question of the post-Persian wall, Herodotus is silent. It is not part of his story, and he has the Battle of Mycale to relate. Thucydides, however, makes clear that the defense of the city was a primary concern after Salamis and Plataea. Themistocles' instruction to the Athenian people was that the whole population of the city, men, women, and children, should take part in the wall building, sparing neither private nor public building that would in any way help to further the work, but demolishing them all. And you see there the main circuit of the Themistoclean wall, particularly up at the northwest, where there's the main city gate of Athens. And that is the circuit that was built immediately after the retreat of the Persians following Salamis and Plataea. So if Thucydides is reliable here, the Athenians built their fortification to a defensible height before they dealt with their own private needs and housing. His description of the result, it was in this manner that the Athenians got their wall built in so short a time. And even today, the structure shows that it was put together in haste, for the lower courses consist of all sorts of stones, in some cases, not even cut to fit, but just as they were taken when the Greek men brought them in, and many stelae from grave monuments and other work stones were built in. For the circuit of the city wall was extended all around, and because of this, they laid hands in haste on everything. Diodorus also has an account of the building of the walls, somewhat more lengthy than Thucydides, and again indicating that he drew from additional sources. His account of the actual construction, quote, "The Athenians began with great enthusiasm to build the walls, sparing neither houses nor tombs, and everyone joined in the task, both children and women, and in a word, every foreigner and slave, no one of them showing any lack of zeal." In short, Diodorus is specifying that metics and slaves were also part of the workforce. Next slide, please. Perhaps equally interesting in the matter of the wall is Diodorus's account of some indirect evidence about the scale of the task in his description of the fortifications at Syracuse, built by Dionysius in 401 BC. Quote, "He gathered the peasants from the countryside, from whom he selected 60,000 capable men, and parceled them out to the space to be walled. For each stade, he appointed an architectone, and for each plethron, a mason, and the laborers from the common people assigned to the task numbered 200 for each plethron. Besides these, other workers, a multitude in number, quarried out the rough stone, and 6,000 yoke of oxen brought it to the appointed place." After describing various incentives to get the work done, Diodorus concludes, "The wall was brought to completion in 20 days. It was 30 stades in length, which is 6 kilometers, and of corresponding height. There were lofty towers at frequent intervals, and it was constructed of stones 4 feet long and carefully jointed." Thomas Rose, my colleague, has recently reminded me of another instance of fast wall building at Alexandria Escate on the Tanais River, a circuit twice as long as Syracuse at 60 stades, built by Alexander in either 17 or 20 days, depending on your source. Next plan, please. The Themistoclean circuit at Athens is close to the same length as that at Syracuse, at 6.5 kilometers long, and it too was built in haste. Like Syracuse, it will have required literally tens of thousands of workers. But did it take about the same 20 days at Syracuse or less? Note that the Athenians foraged tombstones and building debris, which will have spared them much of the huge expense of time and labor transporting new stone from the quarries, as well as the challenge of finding 6,000 yoke of oxen, as did the fact that they had only to build the wall to a defensible height as noted twice by Thucydides. We need also to consider how much time Themistocles' well-known delaying tactics, as described in Thucydides in negotiating with the Spartans, created for the Athenians to build their wall. That in turn depends in part on how long it took ambassadors to get from Athens to Sparta and back. The distance from Athens to Sparta is somewhere between 235 and 250 kilometers, say 140 to 150 miles, depending on the route taken, which is to say that an average trip on foot should be about 8 or 9 days. Next slide, please. No, back one. Thank you. Herodotus, in his account of the Persian royal road, tells us that it was about 2,700 kilometers from Susa to Sardis. And he goes on to say that a caravan could do the journey in 90 days, which comes out to a daily rate of about 30 kilometers a day. Next slide, please. The Vicarello cups dating to the 1st century AD carry inscribed itineraries which record the total distance from Cadiz to Rome, listing all 104 stops along the way. Next slide, please. Amazingly, the distance is almost exactly the same as that of the Persian Royal Road at 2,700 kilometers. And the average daily distance covered in the itinerary is 27 to 30 kilometers, or 16 to 18 miles a day. Somewhat faster if they traveled on horseback, perhaps closer to 5 or 6 days. Next slide, please. Themistocles, there's a picture of the itinerary on the Vicarello cups. And you can see the distance from stage to stage, and each of the stages named on these wonderful silver cups that I'd never heard of before, but they match exactly what we hear from Herodotus about the royal road at the other end of the Mediterranean. Themistocles' well-known delaying tactics, as outlined by Thucydides, should have provided ample time for the construction of the wall. Next slide, please. When we turn back to the archaeology, we make our way to the Kerameikos. We have the ancient accounts of a new, hastily built wall in the literary sources, making extensive use of reused material or spolia, especially gravestones. And that is what we find. Next slide, please. The situation is summarized by Anita Theokaraki in her study of the Themistoclean circuit, quote, representing a rare instance where one can observe a concurrence between literary evidence and archaeology, the reuse of materials in the construction of the wall that was noted by Thucydides has been confirmed by archaeological investigation at a minimum of 10 excavation sites. The surfaces of grave reliefs were often hacked off, hacked off for reuse among other building materials. Here then, the archaeology and literary tradition go largely hand in hand. Next slide, please. The evidence for the Persian destruction reviewed above can be subdivided chronologically, as Lindenlauf, Stewart, Hurwitz, Sumpara, and Klein have done for the Acropolis, and Shear and Lynch in the Agora. It can also be divided functionally. The Acropolis and the shrines of Attica showing particular savagery on the part of the Persians, matched by the eventual lavish rebuilding by the Athenians of the destroyed temples. Next slide, please. Nope, that's okay. In the Agora, we can sense the loss and burden of rebuilding hundreds of houses, the extent of the damage preserved in the household wells and domestic deposits. Next slide, please. And in the Kerameikos, we find the resilient Athenians dealing with devastated cemeteries by reusing the material immediately available to provide themselves with a new circuit wall in order to meet whatever challenges lay in the decades ahead. Temples, houses, grave monuments, and city walls are all part of the story. Next slide, please. Seen from a Persian perspective, it could be argued that the expedition was a clear, though costly, success. Xerxes took and utterly destroyed the remaining Greek mainland city that had participated in the Ionian Revolt and exacted a huge price for the defeat at Marathon. What makes this position somewhat hard to maintain is the extraordinarily fast and effective recovery of Athens over the next 50 years. A large naval empire, buildings that still rank among the finest ever built, and a cultural fluorescence against which most societies are still judged today, against all the odds. How did this happen? A single answer is unlikely to emerge given the generally contentious character of most scholars, but in theory, it cannot hurt to consider some of the factors which may have been relevant in the Athenian success and recovery. Wealth and plunder may have played a role. The figures are hard to arrive at, but it is worth remembering that the Athenians played a major role in all the victories over the Persians, and the size of their contingents and their valor assured that they got a substantial share of the awards. In imagining the amounts available, we have little evidence, and that mostly indirect. Nonetheless, it is worth noting the following. Next slide, please. At Delphi, after Salamis, the Greeks sent up a tithe, or 1/10 of their gains, to Delphi, one large enough to erect a bronze statue 12 cubits, or 18 feet high, according to Herodotus. Quote, they divided the spoil and sent the first fruits up to Delphi, whereof was made a man's image 12 cubits high, holding in his hand the figurehead of a ship. After Plataea, in the Persian camp, the Greeks found tents adorned with gold and silver, and couches gilded and silver plated, and golden bowls and cups and other drinking vessels, and sacks they found on wagons, wherein were seen cauldrons of gold and silver. And they stripped from the dead that lay there their armlets and torques and daggers of gold. As far as many-colored fabric, it was regarded as nothing. Much they stole and sold to the Aeginetans, insomuch that the Aeginetans thereby laid the foundation of their great fortunes by buying gold from the Spartan helots as though it was bronze. Next slide, please. I think, yes, thank you. Having brought all the stuff together, they set apart a tenth for the god at Delphi, whereof was made and dedicated that golden tripod that rests upon the bronze three-headed serpent nearest to the altar. And here you have the modern reconstruction that was set up a few years ago at Delphi. The original we just saw in the Hippodrome at Constantinople, and on the right, a drawing showing how the snakes' heads were used to carry and display the golden tripod that was part of the war booty after the Battle of Plataea. In addition to this tripod at Delphi, the victorious Greeks could also afford to dedicate a bronze Zeus at Olympia, 10 cubits high, and a Poseidon at the Isthmus, 7 cubits high. And according to Plutarch, they spent an additional 80 talents to rebuild the temple of Athena at Plataea. In short, the Greeks and Athenians were not impoverished given their access to what they won on the battlefield and what the Persians abandoned in their hasty retreat from Greece. A third source of booty came from the largely ignored Battle of Mycale, said by Herodotus to have involved a Persian army of 60,000 people and a Greek fleet of 110 ships. The Athenian contingent under the command of Xanthippus, the son of Ariphron. The Athenian contingent is also said to have comprised close to half the Greek forces and to have displayed exceptional bravery. Once the battle was won, the Greeks, quote, set fire to the Persian ships and to the entire camp, but not before they had brought the booty out onto the beach and discovered some caches of money. There are no actual figures for the value of the booty or the Athenian share from Salamis, Plataea, and Mycale, but it seems likely the Athenians were not destitute. Thucydides gives an account attributed to Pericles and dated in the 430s of the resources the Athenians had available for war on the Acropolis. Among other things, he lists uncoined silver and gold dedications worth at least 500 talents, which included Persian booty, scylla medica, and treasures belonging to other gods. So 50 years after the Persian removal, the Athenians still have some of the booty stored on the Acropolis. Next slide, please. It is also worth noting that the Athenian decision not to rebuild their temples immediately afterwards will have left more funds to be invested in other aspects of their recovery. Estimating the total cost of these temples, which were built in the second half of the 5th century on the motion of Pericles, is an exercise in futility. But with no fewer than 10 monuments to replace in marble, the cost must have been considerable. The decision may indeed have been made on religious or commemorative grounds at the time, but it also had the practical effect of allowing Athenian financial resources to be directed elsewhere for a generation, and will presumably have been a significant factor in the speed and success of the Athenian recovery. Any homeowner who needs a new car or who has a child to educate understands the concept of deferred maintenance. Population must have been a considerable factor also. The fact that it was preserved by sending the women and children and others to Salamis or the Peloponnese, while thousands of men took to the triremes, meant that casualties in Athens itself was kept to an absolute minimum. That available manpower was surely an essential element in the Athenian ability to build a new and larger circuit wall. In this connection, it is hard not to attribute much of the Athenian success to the quality of Athenian leadership, particularly that of Themistocles, with his overarching vision of Athens as a naval power. Next slide, please. Which led to the fortification of the Piraeus and the investment of the silver from the mines at Lavrion in the construction of a fleet of 200 triremes. These were built nominally to oppose Aegina, since the Persians were far away and not an obvious or immediate threat to Athens, but these ships were available and actually used at Salamis. The long-term effect and intention, of course, to convert Athens to a sea power, leading to an increase in democracy and largely opposed by Aristides and Miltiades. Next slide, please. The success at Salamis is also in a large part based on the desertion and abandonment of Athens, protecting the citizen body, preserving the army and the population at the expense of the city itself. And here we see the Hellenistic copy of Themistocles' decree calling for the abandonment of the city and the saving of the population. Next slide, please. Take away any of these elements and possibly the whole sequence collapses, with Athenian history taking a very different course. In short, the Athenians after Salamis will have had wealth, a critical mass of population, and a visionary, steadfast, and not entirely trustworthy leader. The Persian destruction of Athens and its aftermath, as seen through both literature and archaeology, remains one of the inspiring stories and lessons from antiquity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. There's so many things that I want to ask you about, and I have to remember that we have an audience here. But I'll just say that that your point about Themistocles and leadership at the end reminds me, of course, that if Herodotus is to be believed, the Athenians had to vote to give up that extra money that they had mined out of Lavrio. And that money was going to be distributed to individuals.
True enough.
So the Athenian people themselves play an amazing role in voting to take money literally out of their own pockets, so that they would have this fleet that ultimately could be used in the protection of Athens.
Absolutely.
All right, I'm going to look at our questions here now and play the role of intermediary. All right, let's see. Okay. There's this question here about I believe this is probably about the old temple on the Acropolis. Was that temple destroyed by the Persians, or was it dismantled by the Athenians before 480 BC for the construction of the Parthenon? This means about the old Parthenon, I guess. Is
The older Parthenon, yes. Yes, that we argue about that endlessly, both where it stood and why it was taken down and when it was taken down. The usual, one of the standard stories is it goes underneath the Parthenon. It dates the mid-6th century to judge from the style of the sculpture. It is dismantled in order to make room for a newer Parthenon celebrating the victory over at Marathon in 490. And it's only half built in 480 when the Persians come and destroy it. And then eventually is followed by the Parthenon. That's one of the sequences that people follow for what to do and how to explain the oldest temple of Athena. But on the north side of the Acropolis, you also have the one dated later in the 6th century that's mostly of limestone with marble trim. That one will have been standing and in use. It's more or less in location, the predecessor of the Erechtheion, and in some ways probably the more important of the two temples on the Acropolis. Whichever temple occupied the northern side of the Acropolis is, religiously speaking, the older of the two, or the more important of the two. But the earlier pre-Persian sequencing on the Acropolis is very complicated, and you can find a theory to match almost anything you want.
Well, I remember long ago when I was writing my dissertation, going down a rabbit hole about the old temple on the north side and the question of the opisthotomus and what was left standing. Was there enough left standing there that the back room of that old temple could be used, say, as a treasury? Do you have any thoughts about that, John?
They refer to that. They refer to the Herodotus, I think it is, refers to it, the opisthotomus facing west. And I can readily believe there was something they could use. The best parallel is up in Phocis at the site of ancient, I guess it's Abi these days. It's Callipothe is its modern name. And there the Germans dug a temple that's said by Pausanias to have been burnt by the Persians. And they found an archaic temple, and on top of that, a late 5th century temple. And in between the two, what we think of as a temporary shrine. It's a tiny room, and it had an altar, and it had a little bronze kouros actually attached to the altar, and it had things lying on the altar. And generally, we believe that was what they used in the 50 years till they got around to rebuilding their temples.
I see.
And then it was just covered up as it was and buried underneath the later 5th century temple. But that's a very impressive parallel, if you will, for a temporary shrine when you're not ready to rebuild the whole thing.
Right.
I can believe the opisthotomus facing west. I should have said, but I will say now, so we don't get the question, the way you burn a temple, which is of stone, is to use your imagination. What you have to imagine is a Greek Orthodox church with hangings on the walls, tapestries and rugs and blankets and things, with wooden furniture at the bottom, with lamps powered by olive oil. And if you knock over one lamp and get one hanging burning, that will bring the fire up to the roof and the ceiling. Those beams are huge. We know that from the size preserved in the cuttings of the stone elements. And once that gets going big and it collapses, you will have a fabulous bonfire in the middle of your temple. And depending on the heat and depending on the time, that will cause the walls basically to expand on the inner face because of this tremendous heat, and the outer face can't keep up with it, and that will start to compromise the integrity of the block, and basically the inner side will just turn to dust. And then from that time, again, if it's long enough and a fierce enough fire, that will cause everything else to collapse.
Right. Interesting. Is there ever a sign of a temple or a building being destroyed and a temple or a building next to it not being? Is there any evidence of targeting of a particular kind of building and leaving another kind of building alone?
Not that I'm aware of, not in this period, this instance. There's certainly places where you get a building that's destroyed and its neighbor isn't, but that can be an accidental fire. I can't think of one involving enemy action, but I would have to think about that a little bit.
Right. All right, I have another question here. This is from my colleague at the American College of Greece, Tobias Myers. Thank you for this fascinating talk. My question concerns the interpretation of material versus literary evidence, as in the case of Phoenix, Arizona, where either 1 out of 4 or 3 out of 4 households consumes beer, depending on whether one interviews the homeowners or examines the household garbage, as you pointed out. In your opinion, what, if any, value does the literary evidence have in the face of contradictory archaeological evidence? Are there cases in which it can help us avoid misinterpretation, in quotes, of the archaeological evidence?
I assume there are instances, but I can't give you one right now. I'm sorry. It's, if you get it and it's written on stone, if you get it from an inscription rather than a late author, you might be inclined, though that's also then an object and material as well, you might be inclined to believe the evidence on an inscription more than either literary sources or some of the archaeological evidence. You can certainly misinterpret archaeological evidence spectacularly. I've done it several times. Oh, you can. But I promise you, it's not very hard to do. And then you just have to change your mind. You just have to not be too rigid in your misinterpretations.
Being willing to change your mind is not something that most classicists have much
Very
of.
hard. Yeah, we all have big heads.
I had an archaeologist once tell me that we would be better off without Thucydides and Herodotus.
Well, some authors you wonder a little bit.
But I was fully prepared for your talk to basically undermine the extent of the destruction described in Thucydides and Herodotus. But of course, you've done just the opposite. You've absolutely confirmed their account. And I wonder if in your career, you would say that your archaeological work has tended to give you more or less confidence in our best literary sources, let's say.
Yeah, it depends on the authors, but yes, I would say it's the one thing I'm absolutely certain of is I almost always believe in ancient source over any modern scholar. But I would say Pausanias is surprisingly reliable, and I'm a huge fan of Herodotus. I'm not sure about other sources. So I think you're right. It would depend on the source you're talking about as to how much you might choose or not choose not to believe him. The person who did this the best, as far as I'm concerned, or methodologically, was Kendrick Pritchett, who was basically a historian, and he wanted to know how much he could trust his historians. And he decided the best way is by topography, because that doesn't change so much. And if you can go out and match the topography to what Herodotus or Arrian or anybody says to you, you can either have more or less faith in that source if they get it right. If they get it wrong, then obviously they're likely to get everything else wrong. But that's an immutable. To be sure, the course of a river can change somewhat. But more often than not, if he could get himself over a pass where so-and-so says the army went, then that would increase or decrease his belief in a different kind of material evidence.
Yeah, that exact passage by Pritchett on topography was the reason I finally decided I had to learn something about ancient battles and teach warfare in antiquity, which I always hated ancient accounts of battles, but Pritchett convicted me that I better learn about the battles and the topography if I'm really interested in the ancient historians.
For a historian, that's one of the best ways to go, because we can misinterpret the archaeological evidence, which is man-made also.
Okay, I'll stop asking my own questions now, and I'll ask another one from the audience here. Would you consider the famous quote of wooden walls will save Athens, and referring to ships, an actual defiance of the Athenians to stone fortification? Well, there's an interesting question.
Yeah. No.
Okay.
I think the Athenians, I think basically you go with either stone walls or mud brick walls. I don't think you go with wooden walls. The Athenian walls in most periods were mud brick on top of a low socle of stone. So they once you get 3, 4, 5 feet off the ground, then you're going really fast if you're building in mud brick.
Right.
And certainly for later phases, the wall is not stone all the way up. It's mostly mud brick, which is a wonderful material because it will absorb the shock of a battering ram rather than fall down. And then you got to get your battering ram out of the wall to try to hit it again.
Right.
As long as you plaster it and keep it roofed, I think wood is not part of the story from my point of view.
See, you left us with a very positive image of Themistocles, and of course, he doesn't get such good press from some sources later on because of his post-Persian War career. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder what value you put in the accounts. Herodotus, in fact, at places seems to be buying into the Themistocles was playing a double game story. So I wonder how much you think it was simply his later career that infected this earlier account, or how should we look at Themistocles?
Well, if you put along with the 3 big ones, like population, abandoning the city and building walls, there's all those things around the Battle of Salamis that he is said to have done to fool the Persians. And I see no way of knowing at this stage, if we can't tell, literally, I can't tell what happened yesterday when I try to read the press. Literally. Depends on which channel I'm on as to how an event is explained. So I think our chances of finding it out over 2,500 years are virtually nil.
Absolutely true. All right. Okay, another question from the audience. One powerful image from your talk is the Athenians' use of their own ancestors' tombstones in the urgent construction of defensive walls. The military use of tombstones is especially striking given the cultural importance of proper treatment of the dead in ancient Athens, as in so many cultures. Can we surmise anything about the psychological implications for the Athenians of using tombstones to build walls? What, if any, evidence do we have for the lived reality of this event?
Not much. It happens in other instances. I think it's at Demetrios, the walls at Demetrios, Pagasai up in Thessaly, or also many of the walls are made up of tombstones. And that's hitting a question I'm just beginning to worry about or wonder about. And that is something that amazes me. When you look at this, I think it's 8,000 tombstones from Athens that I've read in the corpus, that what the Athenians will tell you is the name, the father's name, and what town he comes from or what deme. And they do not tell you this single piece of information that we would regard most important as to when did they live and how long did they live for. And the number of times they tell you how old the person was is about 3 out of 8,000.
Wow.
You go to Roman inscriptions, they're going to tell you how long they lived in years, in months, in days, and sometimes hours, and they will give you the consular dates for when this happened. And this seems to me a staggering difference in 2 major cultures that we've always studied, and I've never seen anybody mention it. So I think if you look at Athenian gravestones, they're amazingly quiet in terms of what they're thinking about the people involved. That yes, you have to take good care of your father's tomb as best you can. But we're told that again in the literary sources, and you have to have shown that you paid for their proper disposal and all sorts of things. And it's cited in the orators that I did this, I did that for my parents. But I see no good way of being certain except that silence about the biography of their predecessors absolutely amazes me.
Right, amazing. Okay, another question. Was the treasury at Delos used to fund the Parthenon or booty from the Persians? I guess is the 2 possibilities, or
I would think both, because certainly the allies and the Athenians got really mad. In theory, the Persian booty is the Athenians to spend as they want. So as long as Pericles could persuade the Boulé that that was worth doing, or the ecclesia, that's fine. But there's also huge yelling and screaming from the allies who are still being charged for fighting the Persians as the Athenians rebuild their temples.
You mentioned, Pericles, of course, in the buildings on the Acropolis and Themistocles, but Cimon didn't even get a mention here.
He didn't. I know that's bad of me. You're absolutely right.
I think isn't there a passage in Plutarch where he takes some booty, and it's actually described that it's used to build the north wall of the Acropolis or something?
Yep, south wall of the Acropolis.
South wall. Okay.
Yep, absolutely. And that, I think the booty is fair game. If the part that the state gets, that's theirs to spend as they see fit, I would imagine. But even in building the south wall, they still had Persian booty left over. On the other hand, maybe Cimon was using the Eurymedon and his own personal victories, or the ones with what I think of post-Persian victories, involved, in Cyprus and at the Eurymedon River and places like that. So he may have been using the money that he himself created for the Athenians, which would give him more authority to spend it.
It's always interested me that the constructions associated with Cimon tend to be in the lower city, around the Agora, et cetera. And Pericles, the constructions we associate with him are up on the top of the Acropolis. And I always wondered if there's some significance to that.
I don't know, unless the oath of Plataea is still in force
Right.
when Cimon's building.
That's a good explanation.
Because
Okay.
he's certainly proud of it. I mean, the painted stoa is all about military victory.
Right. All right, another question from the audience. This is from Heraleus Daskanothanasis, Harris. A non-specialist question for Professor Camp. The Agora has been dug for decades. Are there more things to discover, or have we just about found everything there is to be found? I think I know the answer to this.
We're getting closer, but we're not there yet. Yeah. But we know I'm pretty sure we have found what we call the Laocorean in the last 3 years. And that's the spot where, if you will, democracy begins with the Tyrannocides killing Marcus there. And that's taken us all this time to find that. And we did.
You're going to have to come back and give us a talk on that subject too.
Not where we expected to find it either. So
Oh boy.
we honestly don't know what you don't know what you're going to find. There are certain monuments you expect to find, and other ones it's a big pleasant surprise. We're running out of land.
Right, we're running out of land.
We're not going to keep on digging because behind are just commercial establishments and houses, and there's a lot cheaper places to study those than downtown Athens. So if it's not a public monument, we kind of lose interest pretty quick.
Have the changes in techniques of archaeology over the last 40, 50 years taken any of the fun out of it? Or is it just as fun now as it was then?
I think it's changed the focus, but not necessarily the fun.
Okay.
Having those things. You're talking to a dinosaur. So I'm clinging to the past, so I get to do it the fun way.
Well, I'm the guy who apparently can't run a slideshow, so I don't know who the dinosaur is. All right, let me give you another question from the audience here. Thank you for a wonderful talk, Dr. Camp. I'm curious if we have any visual representations on ceramics or otherwise that complement or dispute either the written sources or archaeology around the destructions and rebuildings you've described.
I can't think of any offhand. So little representational material survives. And I don't know, when you see a battle scene, is it generic? Are you definitely fighting Persians? Or are you referring to it by showing the Athenians beating Amazons? And you're referring to it mythologically then rather than historically.
Right. Are there any images on ceramics of something like building? Of putting up a building? Or
not so much architecture? There's one, no, there are very few, and there's one relief I can think of where they seem to be quarrying stones. There's a handful of things where you got to go all over the Greek world to put them all together. There's you can see people digging clay pits in a Corinthian pot. You can see other people firing a pot in another place. Right. You have to really suck it in from absolutely everywhere. It doesn't seem to be a consistent or popular theme. Millions of pictures of battle scenes, again, whether they're generic or whether they're specific, and whether the Amazons are meant to be somebody specific. It's harder to say.
Right. Okay, here's a cheeky question for you from the audience. Could you give an example of a spectacular misinterpretation of archaeological evidence?
I could, but I won't.
Oh, you guys are going to stick together. Is that what this is? This is the Professional Archaeologists Guild. We won't.
Absolutely. I don't want to tell on anybody, and certainly not myself.
Okay, fair enough.
When you look at any 19th century book and you read what they say about anything, topography, and then how we've amended it over time, so that that's why we keep writing new books, because in theory we're using, this is the word I absolutely hate, we're either getting more nuanced or finding out other things that in fact are contradicting what we thought we knew.
Right, right. The word nuanced is generally used by humanists who don't want to take a position on something.
I can't stand it. If I see, yes, I don't like to see it in requests for money. Somebody's doing a more nuanced view of somebody else sounds like they're basically going to copy them with a couple of changes.
Exactly. All right, here's another question. Presuming there was a long-term effect on the psyche of the Greeks from warring with the Persians, which primary sources do you think speak most to that? This is one of my former students, Rachel Podber. Hi, Rachel.
Well, all our sources are so late, except for even Herodotus is late. I don't know how we get to the psyche of anybody that much later. And they're also, they're fighting all the time. I mean, warfare is a daily event in Greece, it seems to me. I'm not good at the psyche, I guess.
You think Euripides is reaching into that territory?
It seems like it, doesn't it? Again, you're using mythology very often to tell the story. Yeah.
It's always fascinated me that once you get past Homer and into classical authors that describe warfare, they almost never talk about wounds.
Yeah.
That Homer is fascinated by the most gory details about individual wounds, but Thucydides and Herodotus just don't talk about it.
No. And then later on, it's the effect on the women and children and slaves, and
right.
Your life can turn on a dime if you end up on the wrong side of a battle. But you're right.
Right. Maybe there's a psychological answer there, you know.
It might be looking at it through time. You might well see something.
Yeah. Another question from the audience. Can archaeology answer if the Persians completely wiped out Athens? Well, I think you gave us a pretty good indication that it was pretty wiped out. Yeah. That maybe I can use that question to ask about the Herodotus says a few Athenians stayed behind on the Acropolis. Yeah. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty much what we don't know of any of it. We don't find any skeletons. We don't find any evidence of what do we want to say, of victims of the Persians, which we occasionally do in other instances. Something I will say this: you have Thucydides' endless description of the plague, and it took until about 10 years ago in building a subway system to find a scrap of archaeological evidence for all the bodies piled in the street, burned on common things, people throwing the bodies down wells and stuff like that he describes. I would have thought a lot of late 5th century wells should have more bodies in them than we've found.
Right.
It amazed me the paucity of archaeological evidence to match a fairly detailed description of odd behavior.
So the absence of any evidence of Persian victims is obviously not proof that there were none.
No, exactly.
All right, another question. Do we have any evidence that graves were also desecrated by the Persians, or that they destroyed only the funeral monuments? Could the fact that the monuments belong to elite families have played a role in their repurposing as building material? There's 2 questions there, I think.
Oh, there's 2 questions there. I don't know. A lot of the fancy graves, of course, not going to be in Athens, or the Kerameikos are going to be out of town. They're going to be in Attica, where you find the Kouroi or Phrasyclea and things like that. They're scattered all over the place, I would have said, but I don't know. The desecration issue, I don't know what to say. It made them mad enough in 200 BC when Philip did it to have a damnatio memoriae of the Macedonians, because he went after the graves and the sanctuaries in Attica because he couldn't take the city.
Right.
That leads to the 2 Macedonian tribes being struck off the list. So there you have the Macedonians doing it. I don't remember hearing if there's evidence from the Kerameikos as to whether Persian period tombs were actually desecrated or not. That's a very good question. And I've never seen any discussion of it, because it would be interesting to know. And the Germans should have that information. But I've never seen it. It's never said. I don't remember any literary source, and I don't remember any reading about it in the archaeological material.
Okay, have another question here from the audience. You offer persuasive reasons to suppose that an Athenian defensive wall existed prior to the Persian invasion. In the face of these arguments, on what basis do naysayers still argue that it didn't? Why aren't they admitting that your arguments are absolutely persuasive and giving up?
Because they've never found a scrap of this wall anywhere. If you have a 3-mile wall, you should be able to find some of it. I think the main reason. I don't know. There aren't that many who still maintain it. So I don't remember any other significant arguments about that.
But this
just the absence of evidence, which isn't, as you say, that isn't evidence of absence.
right.
I don't know of anybody who says there's a circuit wall. It would be nice if you could point to something that said, here's 10 meters of it, here's 50 meters of it. And we can't do that. And that's ridiculous.
Exactly.
We'd be able to somewhere, but we haven't yet recognized it. But I think it's just that the absence of evidence.
Yeah. Well, look, I could keep you here all night answering my own questions, but I think I should just thank you, and thank you on behalf of the audience for a wonderful lecture and incredible generosity on your part to help us mark these two important historical events, the beginning of the Greek War for Independence and the end of the Persian Wars. And in particular, I would just say thank you for reminding us that it wasn't just the city of Athens itself that suffered in this invasion, and that there were people who lived all over ancient Attica, some of whom had probably never been in the city of Athens before, who saw their property destroyed and their temples burned. And I think it gives us even one more thing to reflect on when we look back on these monumental events. So thank you so much, Professor Camp.
Thank you, and to the audience for being there.